With us now to talk more about the latest scorecard that is out today is the president of the State Business Council. Ken Adams is joining us this evening from New York City. Thanks very much for your time, Ken. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, Liz. Thank you.
So this is actually a relaunch of a scorecard system that you had been doing at the Business Council and then dropped. So what's different now?
Well, you know, we've come up with a completely new system, and in this economy with a very, very clear focus on legislative bills that affect private sector job growth and economic recovery. For us, Liz, it's all about jobs, and the question is, are members of the Senate, are members of the Assembly enacting legislation to create jobs in New York, yes or no?
So this is interesting because all of a sudden we are seeing the economy. It's at the national level, it is at the state level, and it is a major focus of both of the parties at this point. Now, what you guys did was similar to what a number of organizations are doing, that you chose a number of bills on which to grade, if you will, state lawmakers' performance. So why don't you give us sort of the top three?
Well, you know, we've got 14 different pieces of legislation in the voter guide, in the Business Council voter guide, including the last two budgets, which raised billions and billions of dollars in new taxes during this terrible recession, and a host of other measures. And the way it works, Liz, is each one of these bills had to come up for a vote in either the Senate or the Assembly, or in some cases, both. And many of them, again, some of them, the Business Council, on behalf of the state's business community, opposed. Some, like long-term extender for economic development power, we supported. So these were all bills related to creating a better business climate, bills that would lead to companies investing in New York and creating jobs, which is the #1 goal everybody shares.
There were also two other things that I think probably viewers would be interested in, although upstate this is less of an issue. Down in the Hudson Valley it is a big issue, and that is the MTA bailout, which included this tax, this mobility tax, that a number of counties are actually suing over at this point. And in addition, there was also the property tax cap, which only passed the Senate and did not pass the Assembly, and I would assume that is something that you were in fact in favor of?
Absolutely. We still are advocating for a statewide property tax cap. And when you talk about, Liz, the MTA payroll tax, you're right. That's why we took bills from the entire 2 years of this legislative session. We look back at that, which was really last year. And it's true, 12 counties in the MTA region down in the city, out on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley, really suffered under the $1.5 billion raised for the MTA through that payroll tax. The rest of the state does not understand we have to pay for that. But remember, the Business Council is the leading statewide business association. So we have members all across the state in all 62 counties, and our voter guide has to reflect their concerns all across the state, including local, regional issues like the MTA payroll tax.
Okay, so here's some really interesting things that we pulled out of the scorecard. For example, there were 3 Democrats in the Assembly that did well. Robin Schimminger, who's of the Buffalo area, Bill Parment, he's retiring this year, and Dennis Gaberzak. These guys are all, actually, Schimminger, 82%, quite high for a Democrat, everybody else in the 50s. But their leader, Sheldon Silver, gets a 0. And in addition, you have 63 other Assembly members with a 0. That's, wow, that's not so great.
No, it's not. And again, we call it a voter guide for a reason. We really want folks who are going out to vote this election year to look at this voter guide and at least get an understanding of how their individual senators or assembly people voted when it came to the state's economy and to economic recovery. So for Assemblyman Schimminger, kudos to Assemblyman Schimminger up in the Buffalo area for a very high score on these 14 bills. And folks who scored lower, voters should know that. You should know how your representatives in Albany are voting on these economic issues. These bills all have economic consequences, and we need constituents, we need New Yorkers to remind their elected officials that the economy is the #1 goal, and reforming this business climate is fundamental. Okay,
but so let's go over to the Senate, where actually in the Assembly, I have to say this isn't terribly surprising because you've more of a downstate interest in more of a sort of left of center interest, if you will, that dominates that chamber, but and tends to be, from the business point of view, less business friendly. On the Senate side, you have a very interesting situation because all 32 Democrats got rankings that were not fantastic, including the upstaters, who tend to be more on the conservative side. 18% for Darrell Albertine, 18% for David Valesky, 9% for Bill Stokowski. He's got a tough primary coming up next week, so that could be problematic. But all 30 Democrats, and we're talking about a time when the chamber is really in flux here, do well. So why will people look at this and say, oh, well, business generally tends to be pro-Republican? None of this is surprising.
You know, again, it doesn't, there is not a built-in partisan angle to the project or to this information. It is what it is, and you've got to look at the performance of the majority conferences, the Democratic majority in the Assembly and in the Senate, and the minority conference, the Republicans in the Senate and in the Assembly. And these 14 bills, again, activity on almost all of them in both houses, and voters need to say if they're incumbent, if their legislator isn't a Republican or a Democrat, they can simply look up their voting stance on these bills, and then it plays out the way you've described it, Liz. Again, our idea here is identify these 14 proposals, remind voters the economy is what matters, and then ask them, check up on your local representative in the Senate and the Assembly. How did he or she vote on these 14 proposals? And we just lay it out for you, and that's the evidence. And yes, you're right. One could draw the conclusion that Republicans in both conferences really have a much higher score and did much better in terms of supporting all of this pro-economic legislation. Just
very quickly, you know, you are going to be issuing some endorsements for the first time in a while. Also, Unshackle Upstate, another business-heavy organization, is doing the same. All of a sudden, we're seeing business get very active again, very engaged, whereas labor is taking a little bit of a step back. Why do you think this is?
Well, I can't speak for what labor may be doing, but I can tell you that the economic crisis in the country, and certainly in New York State, is profound. People know that. Viewers of this show know that. And you're right. Business organizations like the Business Council of New York State are really stepping up this year, including really getting involved politically into these elections in ways we have not in the past. And that's because, Liz, there is so much at stake. We have really got to send a message to Albany that economic recovery is number one, and enacting legislation that improves the business climate, lessens the tax burden, makes the state more friendly to new investment. It's the only way we're going to get investment and jobs in 2011. And go back to some of those fundamental reforms you and I have talked about before on this show: property tax cap, spending cap, lower taxes, debt reform, and public employee pension reform. Those fundamentals have to happen in the new year. We will have a governor championing some or all of those reforms. The issue here with our voters' guide is let's get members of the legislature elected who will support those reforms as well.
Well, Ken Adams, will be checking back with you after these endorsements come out. I want to thank you very much for joining us in the meantime.
Thank you.